Started. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Annie Levinsky. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Denver, and I'm curious how many of you are attending your first RE Denver Forum tonight? Okay, about half and half, so that's pretty good. Well, welcome. We're excited to have you here. We started these forums about almost 2 years ago, and since then we've offered 12 different topics, all designed to provide the space for the community to talk about what matters in our city, its unique identity, and how we approach change. If these topics are important to you and you're interested in the subject tonight, we hope that you'll consider becoming a member of Historic Denver. We are a nonprofit organization, and membership is a big part of how we are able to sustain our mission and continue to be an advocate. So you can join at historicdenver.org. You can talk to Sigri on our staff. She's in the back, our development associate. Or we can make it really easy for you. You can pull out your cell phone and you can text the word historic to 56512. You'll get a text back to follow up, and you can get signed up that way, so really simple. And Bob, one of our fearless board members and vice chair of our board, is holding up the little cards that have that instruction on how to join if you want to grab one from him or in the back before you leave tonight. I also want to thank our current sponsors and supporters. Sopra Communities has been our sponsor for the series this year, along with the support we get from the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District and from our own Action Fund, which has been raised by our board and supporters. We offer these 6 times a year on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, every other month. So we'll be offering a forum again in July, although that forum will be a partnership with Denver Design Week. So stay tuned for details about that. They have a lot of great things planned. But I want to transition now and talk just briefly introduction about tonight's topic and then turn it over to our speakers because they have a lot of great stuff to share with you and to talk about. But the topic changing landscapes came to mind for Historic Denver for a variety of reasons. We've certainly noticed over the last few years that we've become increasingly involved with landscapes, whether it's parks or parkways or streetscapes or neighborhoods or campuses. We more and more are talking about collections of places or open spaces, as much as talking about buildings. And we wanted a chance to really dig into that a little more tonight. I think one thing that is notable about Denver is we only have 2 national historic landmarks in the metro area in the city of Denver. They're both fairly recent, and they're both cultural landscapes. So I think that says something about Colorado and Denver's culture, that the places we have so far held up as the most significant places in our city are landscapes. And they are, of course, the landscape right behind me, Civic Center Park, and then the landscape outside of the city at Red Rocks. And we will be touching on Red Rocks a little bit later tonight. And we all experience these places in our everyday lives, whether we're going for a picnic with our family, riding our bikes, shopping in a commercial corridor, or dining at an outdoor restaurant. We're engaging with a cultural landscape. And these are the places that we're shaping and that have been shaped by those who came before us. And with each generation, they gain new layers of meaning and association. And so even as we engage in these places, we know that change is happening all the time. And so Ann Kamara is going to talk to us a little bit about what a cultural landscape is and how change has become an inherent part of them. And after Ann's presentation, we'll explore several case studies with our expert panelists, and I will introduce each of them as the presentations proceed. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussions. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ann, and then she can come on up and talk a little bit more about what it is we're going to be exploring this evening. Ann is a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Colorado at Denver, where she has taught for many years. She worked with students on the first historic American landscape survey in Denver for Lawrence Halprin's Skyline Park, when that park was altered more than 15 years ago now. And she is an expert on the topic of cultural landscapes and their meaning. So welcome, Ann.
So the definition of a cultural landscape, part of what we talked about, we've met a couple times to go over all of this, and this idea of introducing you to what is a cultural landscape and how do we understand one, how do we identify one, how do we mark its temporality and its change, became one of the themes that we really thought was important. This idea that landscapes are constantly evolving places, and that subjective idea of the evolution of place is something that's very inherent to and important to understand about cultural landscapes. And tied to that is, what kind of meaning do we attach, and where does that meaning lie as a cultural group, as a body of people who regard a particular place? And these are some definitions. The top one is from the National Preservation Brief number 36, which is a really important cultural landscapes document. Published in 1994 with several drafts floating around, sort of rogue, for about a decade before that. And it really explains that it's a physical space, a geographic area that contains these kinds of elements, the history of its people and animals, associated with an event, activity, person or groups of people. And the assumption here is that it's exhibiting some sense of values of the community or the culture, and that those are evident somehow in the built space. And the bottom one is mine, which I use with the students all the time. A cultural landscape to me is a place that shows this interaction of people and place over time, and that by definition involves this temporality. So I also thought it was important to contextualize why we're now thinking about cultural landscapes. And I put a time frame on it. We have buildings and a lot of the historic structures in historic places like Williamsburg that arise as a focus of American culture between the two world wars. But for landscapes, I think the change really happened in the 1960s when we start, and maybe slightly earlier, with people like this guy J.B. Jackson, who wrote academic and popular articles about what he was seeing in the ordinary landscape. So he's trying to say, hey, look around you. Everywhere you see something, it's the possibility of a demonstration of a particular set of cultural values or patterns of use or ideas about place. So we see here, that's going to be on the left, Discovering the Vernacular Landscape was a very important book. This idea that this landscape with its signs and its Dairy Queen, kind of like if we go either way on Colfax, what is it about that place? Well, it's a cultural landscape. It shows this accretion of things over time, and although it stays spatially the same, it's still a street or an avenue, it begins to reflect lots of changes that we can see in aesthetics of signs and these kinds of things. And then even some of these landscapes, normally we wouldn't think of power lines as a demonstration of a cultural act or a sense of value. But this is a sketch by J.B. Jackson in studying this idea of the ordinary landscape, the vernacular landscape. The other piece that ties into this, I think, is the beginning of documentation programs. So in the 1930s, as we see here, there was a program that started, Historic American Buildings Survey. It was begun in 1933. It was an FDR kind of work program to document the historic structures and buildings in the United States for perpetuity as a way of preserving them in case they got damaged, fell apart, declined with age. After that came the Historic American Engineering Record, and I have an example of that right here. In fact, Skyline Drive, or Blue Ridge Parkway, is an example of a historic engineering record. It's an engineered road with the landscapes that are attached to it. And the most recent one in that triumvirate is actually the Historic American Landscapes Survey. And there's an interesting conundrum with that, because for a while people kept thinking we can't really document a landscape. So they took on Blue Ridge Parkway for the engineering record. And as Annie said, we did Skyline Park. So in the process of figuring out how do you understand what a landscape is, what its parts are, that's a little bit more of what we'll see in the next few minutes. The landscape survey that we did was stuck in trying to document it according to the criteria for a building, which is pretty easy. A building is a figural structure. You can understand it has doorways and window sashes, and it's made out of certain materials. And the issue became, how do you understand what to pick out and identify and document for a landscape? So that's part of what we'll see. And in this case, an example would have been the documentation of the roadway itself, then the bridge that you see spanning it, built by the CCC, the pathways that set you up to sight lines, the pull-offs, the many parts of it. So this is actually the very first landscape that got surveyed. And not surprisingly, it's a pretty formally structured garden. It's Meridian Hill Park in Washington, D.C. It was done in the early 1980s. And it had a lot of concrete work. So it was easy to understand because of its stairs, its ramps, its railings, and the landscape part became secondary. But this was a great step in that idea of trying to figure out how to document a site that had carried a lot of importance. So the vernacular landscape and then this initiative to begin studying places and documenting them, I think, have built towards our current growing interest in cultural landscapes. So there are 4 types of landscapes that are defined as cultural landscapes. A historic designed landscape, and I'll define what each of these are and give you some examples shortly. A vernacular landscape, a historic site, and an ethnographic landscape. And these places all have the same things in them. They have trees and walkways, and maybe they have water, and they have structures and vegetation. But it's the purpose behind which they were created and who created them and how they are used or how they function that identifies which of those 4 categories they land in. This is from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, which is another key piece in this, and there's a thread there that I want to pull forward. Preservation Brief number 36, which was produced in the 1990s, 1994, was influenced heavily by a gentleman who is now the head of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, Charles Birnbaum. And he started this as a nonprofit after he left the Park Service and had done the work for Preservation Brief 36. So they have the 4 landscape types identified down here. Designed, which is that one, the Lily Pool in Chicago, Illinois, historic site, Montgomery Place, Annandale and Hudson, an ethnographic landscape, the Taos Pueblo, and then a vernacular site, Two Harbors, Minnesota, which is more of an industrial project. So I'm going in a different order because I wanted to end on historic designed landscapes. This is the actual definition of an ethnographic landscape, and it often taps into things like the burial mounds. That on the left is the Natural Bridge in Virginia. It's a landscape feature that carries with it some mythological and cultural meaning for the First Nations people. So ethnographic landscapes are often ceremonial grounds or have components of things like that in them, but aren't necessarily designed places. They're revered, but they're not necessarily designed. Oh, no, I did. A vernacular landscape evolves because it's been used by people in sort of a continuous time frame. And a great example would be a farm or a collection of properties like a historic district of farms. And there are examples that are, in Indiana, there were a series of documentations in the 1990s of individual farms. And what someone wasn't yet doing was looking at the fact that all those farms lined a river valley and were part of a much larger landscape that was, in fact, the reason those farms were there in the first place. So they weren't looking at that broader contextual idea. They were doing a very good job of understanding the individual pieces, but not necessarily the context. So vernacular landscapes, and I have a couple examples, are the Grant Coors Ranch, for example, and we have ranches all over Colorado that would constitute a cultural landscape that is a vernacular, and it's functional. It can continue to be functional and still evolve through the different changes and things that happen throughout a season over a number of years. Buildings move around. You might be moving the sluices or where you're putting the fences on that working landscape. So vernacular landscapes are often working landscapes. Here is a different one, and this one sort of hedges between vernacular and designed. This is Mount Morrison CCC camp, which was a project studied by one of my students, Kelly Halpin, and the Denver Parks people have provided all kinds of base data. So this is a layout, and in fact, these are the guys that built Red Rocks, which Bill Wank is going to be talking about later. It's an arrangement of barracks and structures and a common sort of community building, a rec hall, and then a mess hall. So they're arranged in a sort of military order, so it's quasi-designed, but it's also vernacular in the sense that it wasn't designed by a landscape architect. It was quite functional, its intention to be laid out to serve these purposes. But what also happens is when you go out there, there are some things that were planted by the guys in the CCC. So this piece lilac trees that begins to talk about that idea of the landscape and how that marking was made in a circle around a flagstone area that probably had a flagpole in it. And it's not the first thing you notice the buildings. So the subtlety of the clues for the landscape are something that you have to become attuned to and start to pay attention to. Otherwise, you miss them. And then designed landscapes. And this one, as it says here, is usually someone who has been trained as a designer and then works to create or execute the layout, the design, the construction of materials. The owner may have been involved. It might have had a wonderful patron. In that sense, it could be an estate. Campuses are certainly part of it. The Boulder campus, even I would argue now CU Denver is getting old enough to be a cultural landscape of sorts. Parks and plazas, like the ones we have behind us. And aesthetic value certainly plays an important role in a designed landscape. And that's part of what comes forward when we decide whether or not it has value for us today is, does the design still carry meaning? Does it still have influence and impact for us? So here are two examples. This right behind us. Then a playground. Now, how do we describe these? So the next bit of this is going to be a lot of vocabulary so that you can now be part of the, in the know with the lingo. Period of significance, when the space came to have meaning. So for example, that CCC camp pre-existed. There might have been a little hunting camp up there, but the period of significance is the 1930s when the Civilian Conservation Corps was in residence and laid it out. This one, the period of significance, probably is the City Beautiful movement when it was laid out. Then integrity is a word that I think everybody else is going to be talking about. Does this place still have the feeling of the original idea or intention? So for a ranch, for example, does it still feel like a ranch? Do you have a sense of the scale and the space? Can you see some of the functional arrangements in its parts? And then there are a whole lot of landscape characteristics that are used to describe these things. Period of significance refers to the time span, and once it's identified, it becomes the baseline, the point of measuring against everything. If the period of significance is the 1930s for that CCC camp, and something happened 40 years later and it became a youth camp, but it still feels like a CCC camp, then it still has integrity, even though its use might have changed. Yes?
I just want to say when it was first built, a lot of the rock that was there was dug out, so it wasn't originally, so there was so much rock moved. But that was connected to Morrison Road, which workers brought a lot of rock. They don't bring granite processing no more, so I'll say if you go up there, you'll see the pile of rocks which have been moved.
So he's already a cultural landscape person. So he's right. A lot of times when you go to these sites, you have to put on these very clear seeing eyes. Where'd the materials come from? Was there something here they moved out of the way? But a period of significance is really important because any landscape has some period wherein its meaning was at its height, or its relevance was at its height. But they change, and they can evolve. Integrity requires this set of 7 principles or qualities, and it's sort of the essence of the site. When you go to a site, does it still feel like it has the values that built it and references to the culture that created it? And can it evolve? Can sites have multiple layers of meaning? Well, yes, they can, and then you have to decide which one's more important. So location, where is it located? What's its design? What's its setting? What are the materials? How's the workmanship? What's the feeling? And is there an association with it to some other series of events or cultural milieu? Then I have, in closing, a list of characteristics that we should consider when you go out to a site to look at it. So when we would go out, or when we would take you out on a field trip, we would start by looking at the natural systems. What was the site before it became what it is now? Red Rocks is a good example. It still had that magnificent formation, but it didn't have stairs, it didn't have roads, it didn't have that layer over it. Is there a watershed or a hydrological system? Where did they get their water supply? The climate, the ecosystems, Vegetation is interesting because you have to look and see what might have been there before a new layer of designed landscape was put in with vegetation and understand its natural context, and then the topography. Back here, it's kind of flat, but there's the Capitol up on the hill and the city county building on the other side, so there was some topographic meaning inherent in that prior to its construction. Spatial organization. How is it arranged? How do the parts work together? Is there circulation, walkways, stairs, ramps? How do people move throughout the site? And this happens in Civic Center Park, in Red Rocks, in Wash Park, on a street. Are there vistas, view sheds, or visual connections linking it to something? And the one I just mentioned, the Capitol to the city and county building, is a view shed that's intentional to the design. And lots of these design sites that we'll be talking about today have some kind of view shed, even if it's just along the road. Are there focal points where they designed? And then are there constructed water features? Are there fountains, drinking fountains even? Canals, cascades, pools, reservoirs. What has been constructed in that place? Are there structures? What are they? Where are they set? How are they related to each other? Other elements, benches, signage, lighting, balustrades, and you can probably think of more things. All the stuff that makes a place have some of that quality, curb lines, and then its functional relationship between the parts and the purpose or utility of the site. And then I'm going to end with an example of vegetation, because it is kind of the squirrely one, because a tree, a shrub is planted, you nurture it, it grows, and then it dies. So the questions become, do you replace it? Can you see it? Is there evidence of it? So this one is an example of sort of cross between a designed landscape. You see the parterre of hedges, it's like a maze on the right, and then the orchard down on the bottom of the image. And that's a working landscape. It's a vernacular landscape with a little bit of that design layer. And then we have this one, which really starts to highlight that idea of these things changing over time. The bottom right is the image just after it was installed in the early 1990s, and the top image is the image of the design as it's finally executed. But 20 years from now, what's that going to look like? And yet it's still a designed landscape, it still carries cultural meaning, it has value. So this evening, my colleagues will be presenting four different case studies with the idea that there's something linking them that is a physical characteristic dealing with a public place and the social practices and associations they have over time. So we wanted to emphasize something about the idea of park, roads, and streets, the idea of mobility, and how these become public spaces. And then are you going to introduce speakers with their topics? So.
Well, thank you, Anne. I think that lays a really good foundation for our case studies tonight. So first off, I'm going to introduce Bill Wink. Bill is the founder and president of Wink Associates, a landscape architecture firm. His Denver projects include the master plan for Red Rocks and for Washington Park, which he'll talk about, as well as design for Lowry Parks and Open Space, the landscape at REI's flagship store, and the landscape adjacent to the Tivoli building on the Auraria campus. Bill holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the University of Oregon and a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture from Michigan State University. He's a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects, and he is a current board member of Historic Denver. So thank you for guiding us in putting this evening together. Bill's going to talk about two aspects of Denver's park and parkway system and the ways that they are alike and different and how they are changing. So thanks, Bill.
Anne gave a great introduction to some of the themes and topics that I'm going to touch on tonight. First of all, both Red Rocks and Washington Park are part of larger systems. And this is the Mountain Park system. And let's see if I can get this right here. Here's Denver. There's the Capitol. Oh, we must have missed a slide. And yeah, anyhow. And both Red Rocks and the Denver Park system have something in common, and it's that notion of mobility that Annie just talked about, and Anne talked about it at some length. And the interesting thing about this is that both systems were developed at the turn of the 20th century, essentially, and we were in love with the car at that point. And when you look closely, this is the Esplanade at City Park. Cars, horses, and people are all mixed in now what we consider to be a sacred pedestrian space. And the mountain park system was connected, including Red Rocks, was connected by a series of scenic drives. So the idea was, in both city and mountain park systems, that you experience the landscape by moving through it. And by moving through it, you connect a series of points in that system of moving, in that process of moving through the landscape. So it's very dynamic, and as Anne was talking about, it includes a number of destinations or places that one arrives at and has different experiences at. So they have a lot in common, but they're in different landscapes, very different landscapes. The mountain landscape really dominates, and it's that notion of natural scenery that most of those parks are built upon, including Red Rocks. Whereas in the city, they're really much more designed landscapes. They're based on a contrived set of spaces and structures that are organized around ideas that are really based in Europe and in more on the eastern coast. And here you see those two systems. And right here is Colfax, basically. This is Sloan's Lake Park, to orient yourself. And here's the mountain park system as it connects out west on Colfax, goes to Red Rocks, and then through a very extensive system of parks. Hopefully, I'll be brief here. A lot of you already know this. And within Denver, of course, the boulevard and parkways connect the parks within the city. So you can have both an urban experience as well as a mountain experience in driving through the systems. In many ways, there's the same. At the same time, they're very different. So this is driving through Red Rocks at the turn of the century, and I just wanted to point out the roadway. I should correct myself here. It's a drive. This is not about getting from point A to B. This is about experiencing the landscape, taking in the scenery, enjoying and feeling what you're passing through. It's about experience. And once you arrive at some place, it's about having very different experiences. I'm not sure what the risk management people would think about that barrier these days, but they had a great time. I hope she survived. And of course, the amphitheater and this wonderful cultural experience. Remember this in terms of how people use Red Rocks. I have some more images. It's pretty interesting. Same process in the city parks. This is Marion Parkway, the bathhouse. You arrive at the park, you then drive have this leisurely path through the park. You experience the different scenes as you pass through the landscape, and then you have these different experiences as you arrive at different places. The interesting thing, and this of course, this is the bathhouse. Things change, don't they? Can you imagine swimming in Smith Lake? I can't either, but it is one heck of a destination and pretty active. I'm just wondering if the neighborhood complained about the noise. But at the same time, it has this kind of romantic quality. You know, it had a great deal of activity. It was a really lively place, just like it is today. On the other hand, you could stroll. It was peaceful and quiet. It's all about the differences in experience and about the quality of the landscape and doing different things there. Ultimately, it's about gathering, I think, coming together. Parks are very social places, and especially our urban parks. So, given that parks change over time, do we need to protect them? If so, how? We master planned Washington Park, and an architect that I know kind of accosted me, and he said, "Why do you need to plant? It's perfect just the way it is." And that's our perception of parks, or many of the landscapes that we love and experience today, is that don't change anything, it's just right. But it's important to understand where the parks came from in terms of, as Anne explained, what was their original intent? What were they? And how have they evolved over time? So, for example, can you see that red dot out there? Is that helpful? Okay. Here are two plans of the evolutions of the roadway and path network in the parks, from Reinhold Schutze's plan, turn of the 20th century, and then Washington Park roadway and paths plan today. Hasn't changed very much. It's pretty much intact. So that is one framework in the jargon of the profession that is intact. So it's the frameworks that we look for as essentially the bones of the plan as to whether or not they're intact as one aspect of assessing the value of the history of the place. And the other are the spaces and the different landscape qualities. In Washington Park, it's the meadows, the groves, and the lakes, essentially, define the spaces. So what I'd like to do is now talk about how they've changed over time and why they've changed. And I call them the two tyrannies of technology. First of all, the lawnmower. The lawnmower was an invention after the Civil War that really changed how we managed landscapes. In some ways, it's based on, I think, a sense of order, but it's also based on lack of maintenance money, I think. So when we started to mow landscapes on a large scale on the image on your left, how we maintained Washington Park, I think, changed it over time. And the other, of course, is the automobile. It was a wonderful thing, and we were in love with it until about the 1960s when we finally decided it was taking control of our lives. And so some of the previous images, and of course this one here, we're very proud of our cars. It's a new experience. It's a new way to enjoy the landscape. And so essentially it took over parks over time. And we have, I think, been taking them back in some ways over the last 20 or 30 years. But what I'd like to do is now compare some different images of the park. And really, I'm doing this to more provoke discussion once we're done with our presentations here as to whether or not some of these changes are good or maybe not so good. So the lily pond, for example, here, it's a very contrived landscape. And you can see its change over time in that the rock garden designed by S.R. Du Bois really has lost its character here. I think not so much from neglect, but from lack of landscape maintenance dollars that are available for gardeners to come out and care for something that requires a great deal of attention to maintain its integrity. And it's essentially been taken over by junipers, which do really well just about anywhere. And then, of course, the lily ponds really are gone. So that sort of evolution in the context of original intent is very important to us. You now have a different experience when you go to the lily pond than when you did if you lived there and walked through in the 1920s. Another one that I find really interesting is the drive going, I believe, to the north, taken from the same vantage point again. I believe this tree is this tree. First of all, this vista, which I've always thought was very carefully planned, not so much. I think there was a mass of shrubs there. And I think they probably were removed by attrition. In other words, either they just got in the way of the mower or some very practical reason they were never replaced. So we now have a vista that I think most people treasure and believe was original to the design. Another really important detail here that I'd like you to remember is the roadway. It's gravel, and it has this very interesting and I think very nice detail. In this scene, it's gotten wider. Remember this, I'm going to come back to it. It's changed the landscape in subtle, but I think important ways. Same thing at Red Rocks. If you remember those original images. This was last Saturday at the Trading Post. overuse is a real issue, especially in Red Rocks, and to a large degree in Washington Park, because we tend to go, because these are social places ultimately, we gather where other people are gathering. So, and it bears looking very closely, especially at this one. There's a cyclist, there are people preparing for a concert, people are parked along the roadway, hikers are hiking in the roadway, there are cars in the roadway, there are conflicts with people leaving the trading post. There's a lot going on here. Is this a good experience? Remember that pleasure drive through this winding roadway? I'm sorry, it's not a roadway. It's a drive. It starts to lose that quality. And then you get uses that were never imagined in Red Rocks. It's that outdoor culture that we now have, I think, that's really changed how these different places are used, and I think in a profound way. I really like this image because these are both families. The notion of the family has changed. So we have to look at society and how it uses parks differently, I think, to really begin to judge how to design parks of the future and how to modify parks that we have and that we treasure, like Washington Park. So in this image, take a look at who's here. There are children, there are adults, they're formally dressed. Some aren't really happy. Look at this lady, not having a great time, but she's there, okay? So it's a family outing, I think, the way we traditionally define a family. I maintain this is a family too. It's a tribal family, if you use a kind of modern vernacular. Everybody's the same age. They're pretty much millennials. Count the dogs in this. I could count 8 just kind of in this area right here. Everybody's got a dog. Okay. There's a slack line here, which I believe to be illegal in parks now. Bikes. Everybody's got gear. Everybody's bringing something to the park because they're spending the day just like this family did, okay? But how they're using the park is really the same but very different at the same time. So you might ask yourself, what are the implications of that in terms of design and the original intent? It's a very interesting way to kind of experience parks. People are using the park in the same way to go and relax and enjoy the landscape. But again, illegal, right here, right, Mark? It's illegal to hang something from the trees, but they're having a great time along the lake, whereas this lady's sitting and enjoying the view in the same but very different way. So direct implications for how we design parks and for how they're being managed and used. And who would have ever thought that somebody would ski Red Rocks, you know? And there's a serious point here, is that we can never anticipate the future in terms of what people will do and how they'll use parks, but I think we always have to go back to that original framework, those frameworks that we talked about, and really ultimately protect the bones of the park. In the case of Washington Park, for example, drives, pathways, and those spaces and tree groves. And same with Red Rocks. And then things like skiing Red Rocks can be okay. But then that notion of intent also includes details. Oops, I'm sorry here. Burnham Hoyt carefully designed Red Rocks as this very carefully conceived set of fairly pure, architecturally pure, if that's a reasonable word, structures. You see no railings in this. Very simple, bold forms within this natural landscape. And to a large degree, that's been maintained to today. But you'll notice, no surprise, we now have handrails. There isn't a railing in sight here. So those details become important because over time, our building codes and other requirements mandate changes to these structures, and types of use can as well. This is the code run amok, I think, at the trading post. I don't mean to be so, I should be a little more diplomatic, I think. But there are railings there for some very good reasons, in that, yes, this provides someone a way to grip on a handicapped ramp. There are these types of railings, you see them here and here, because levels of use are so high, people were damaging the native landscape, and so on and so forth. There's gravel here to keep people out of the planting beds and to minimize maintenance. So I think everything's here for a good reason, but I think we're losing the original intent of having the natural landscape dominate here in this situation. And one could ask, are there other ways of managing this? There may be, there may not, but I think we need to be really aware of that. Also, some very subtle details. If you remember back to that original photograph of the drives in Washington Park, they had these very small swales at the edge. They were gravel. They're now asphalt. And in the older parts of the park, the curbs are also asphalt and very small. This tends to be the tendency today of replacing them with kind of a standard detail for public works, which is a 6-inch concrete curb that you find on any city street in the city. And you start to lose that sense of ruralness, of that rural drive that I think is so important. And interestingly, I think it gives us clues as to how to act there. As soon as you install a 6-inch concrete curb, you give us license to drive 30 miles an hour or 50, whatever. Because it's a city street, it's no longer a drive. So I think those details become really important to how you think about parks into the future. And a few thoughts on closing. This is Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York. An Olmsted Park, probably one of his best works. And most of you know Frederick Law Olmsted as one of the premier landscape architects of the 19th century. What I'd like to point out, and there's been considerable millions of dollars put into restoration of some of the original details. There's also a number, millions more put into new park uses. And this is a contemporary cover over an ice skating rink. Contemporary, but think about this. It's designed in many ways to fade into the background, but it's designed of its time. Is that appropriate or not? We need to have that discussion. Also, I believe this is renovation of a promenade or a walk along one of the ponds or lakes there, but this is a very contemporary bench, probably designed with no feet so it's easier to clean underneath it, using materials that Olmsted would be familiar with, but that are kind of clearly contemporary. So, is that appropriate? Does it meet the original intent? These are very interesting questions. Also, we're going to have to renovate and modify our parks over time. But when you look at Denver and the way, especially central Denver, is growing, our parks, like Washington Park, can't possibly meet the need. So I'm taking the liberty to show some of the parks we're currently working on in terms of what our current park thinking is in terms of what's important and how we might use and design them. For example, in this park, a new park proposed along the Platte River in the River North District. Here is a cottonwood grove where stormwater is treated to improve its water quality before it goes into the river, but you can also sit on these decks in this water quality area in a meadow that you might find along the Platte River and enjoy a picnic, for example. Buildings are being repurposed for park uses, but also for community uses. So is a park a building or a building a park? Is an interesting question and discussion here. Arkins Court, one of the roadways along the river, and you can see the river here, is going to be vacated of cars, in at least part of it. And there are partnerships being developed with developers along the edge to have joint use of that vacated roadway for a promenade. Or another image further down where you can stroll, you can walk your dog, use it like a park, but is it a park? Cities across the country are doing similar things to this. One of the most known is the High Line in Manhattan, in New York, but most cities are really looking at how they can use lost spaces as park space for these emerging neighborhoods. So these are all questions that I think are worth pursuing as we go into a discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Annie. And I just wanted to kind of recognize some of my sources tonight here. So.
But next I'm going to introduce Kathleen King. Kathleen is a landscape architect and urban designer at Design Workshop. She brings her experience in community design and engagement planning and landscape architecture to creatively tackle new challenges and projects. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Colorado. And in recent months, she's been actively involved in planning and analysis related to Federal Boulevard, which, as I think you'll see, is in some ways a designed landscape and in other ways a vernacular landscape, and maybe one you didn't think of as a landscape until tonight. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here tonight. As Annie mentioned, I was on the design and planning team for the Federal Boulevard Corridor Study, and as part of that, I actually learned that Federal Boulevard was or is a designated parkway. Are there other people here that knew that prior to this evening? That's awesome. Great. So one of the things that I really want to touch on today about Federal Boulevard is the dynamics of this landscape, of this roadway, have really changed over time. And what does that mean today? What does it mean for the future as we think about changing needs for transportation and for our park system in general? How do we really prepare for that and continue to preserve some of the really special qualities about Federal Boulevard, but also kind of celebrate some of the new dynamics that are happening along the corridor? So Federal Boulevard was originally developed in 1871 as a dirt road lined with trees. It was part of the town of Highland, and so it was kind of up on the hill, and because of the topography of the way that the city is laid out, you can kind of look into the city of Denver from Federal Boulevard. It was originally just known as the Boulevard, and it became kind of one of the important civic corridors for the Highland, and then was annexed into city of Denver, I think in 1896. So you can see Federal Boulevard was really planned as one of the parkways, boulevards, that is part of the greater parkway system, parks, parkways, and boulevard system in the city of Denver. These maps kind of show that the boulevard, would extend well beyond what at that time was the city limits. Today, Federal is 9 miles long and extends from our southern city boundary to the northern city boundary. But when we think about kind of the historic character, the culturally historic character of Federal Boulevard, we really kind of see some of those elements most evident north of 20th Street, and we'll talk about some of those things. So this photo was taken in the 1920s and shows some of the great characteristics of that original tree-lined street. You can see the roadway is single lane of traffic in each direction. We have a wide tree lawn, sidewalks, this great kind of planting and treescapes. In the 1950s, our priorities for Federal really began to change. And so I don't know if everyone can kind of read the sign in the middle. Yep, so this says Denver Builds, and they're preparing in this image to expand the roadway at Federal Boulevard. And so we see here, also taken in the 1950s, the first piece of that was the removal of all of those trees that originally lined Federal. And then subsequently, we then kind of expanded the roadway and ate up a lot of that tree lawn. This photo I just took from the same location on Saturday. You can see, the roadway today is 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, but I think that, we've sort of reevaluated our spaces along Federal Boulevard over time, and what we now know about street trees and the important characteristics that those bring to a community, but also some of the environmental benefits they've had. A lot of the trees along Federal have been replaced over time. So one of the things I really want to talk about for this is what makes a parkway, what makes Federal Boulevard a parkway, and we'll look at some of the elements and characteristics. So one of the first things is it actually connects parks. It's a major corridor for parks. There are 10 parks that are kind of immediately adjacent to or very, very close and within walking distance of Federal Boulevard. And then we have these 4 great gulches that have now regional trail systems that cross Federal. The other thing that I touched on a little bit earlier was the idea of this tree-lined streetscape. So there's a couple of characteristics of having a tree-lined streetscape that are important to a parkway. And one is, along the roadway, those trees sort of create kind of the wall and boundaries of the roadway. Another feature of this is kind of the atmospheric quality that trees provide. And, having that experience if you're on the sidewalk of walking in the shade and being part of kind of a more natural environment along the parkway is something that, I think is a really important characteristic for a parkway like this. Another feature that we kind of think of when we think about parkways is the setback. So the original setback for Federal Boulevard from the curb is 20 feet, and that allowed us to have those really wide tree lawns, some sidewalk space, and then create sort of a consistent edge on both sides of the boulevard for some of the, these beautiful historic buildings, some of the homes. As Federal developed south of Colfax, we really kind of lost that consistency. And, today south of Colfax, we don't have a consistent edge like that. We don't have sort of that wall of buildings. And in a lot of cases, there's not really space for a tree lawn. And so, that's something that has kind of changed over time. Another thing, this photo is taken at Alameda. This is one of the recently installed medians. But when we think about some of the historic parkways in Denver, like 6th Avenue, those medians play a really kind of important part of giving that park-like atmosphere to a boulevard. The medians along Federal were actually not installed until the 1990s. So is that, kind of a really, truly a historic characteristic of this place? I'm not sure, but it definitely, I think in some locations better than other locations, begins to contribute to a park-like feeling. Another thing that Anne mentioned earlier is this idea of views and vistas. So as you travel south on Federal Boulevard, and I think, I've kind of tested it starting at like 30th Street or 32nd Street. If you're looking south, on a clear day, you can see Pikes Peak. It's very, very clear and really, really beautiful experience. The other piece of it is, if you're on the northbound side of the street, you get these great views of downtown. You can kind of, have this incredible skyscape of all the different sort of pieces. You can see the Capitol, you can see some of our downtown buildings, and then we have the stadium, which is, now sort of a signature element of the skyline. So these are some of the characteristics. This planted tree lawn, the canopy, some of the medians, the consistent setback, and some of these vistas and views. So during the corridor planning process, we went out to the community over a number of months and asked people through a survey, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you think of Federal Boulevard? And so these are the responses. And so the bigger the word is the number of times that we heard it. And so, a lot of those characteristics and qualities and features that I just talked through aren't really showing up on this list. And so, I think that's something to kind of think about. But there are a lot of great words on here and kind of celebratory words. So something that comes up a lot is the idea that federal is multicultural or cultural. The idea that it's colorful, that it's authentic. And what does authentic really mean when we have this changing, constantly changing landscape? Some of the other ideas, it's good, messy, crowded. What do all of those things mean for a cultural place? So one of the first things that I talked about was the idea that Federal Boulevard connects a series of parks. And on the north end of Federal, a lot of those parks kind of come right up to meet the roadway. And there's sort of a more consistent engagement between a park space and what is the parkway. Because of the sort of natural topography south of Colfax, a lot of those parks are further removed. They're kind of lower or connected to the gulches, and you don't have that immediate connection between the boulevard and the parks. And so, I think something that's kind of evolved along South Federal that's really interesting is that some of these parking lot spaces have become those social gathering places, and people are setting up marketplaces. They've got food trucks going on down there, and people are really gathering and engaging along the boulevard, and it still sort of maintains that characteristic of kind of see and be seen as you're on Federal and walking down Federal or spending time on Federal. But the places that this is happening has become parking lots. And maybe it has to do with the dynamics of how people get there. But I think a lot of it is because that's just where there is space today. So these photos aren't great quality. I took them on Saturday while the sun was going down. But I knew that if I went out there on a Saturday evening, the parking lots would be busy. There'd be activity because I've seen it happen, every other Saturday. Another thing that people mentioned a lot was the idea that Federal is multicultural and has this great diversity. And so, I think kind of within the city and regionally, Federal has become a real destination for authentic cuisine, diversity in shopping and having kind of access to these specialty markets, unique restaurants. And then there's also this element of, there's a lot of places on Federal Boulevard. This is the English Center of Colorado, where immigrant communities are kind of welcome and supported and have these places. And so they become really engaged with Federal. And so, how is this important to the future of Federal? When we talk about culture, how does this play into Federal Boulevard? And is this something that, is special and unique enough about Federal that we want to think about preserving? Another thing somebody mentioned was the idea that Federal's colorful. I think if you walk or drive down Federal today, it's something that definitely stands out. Your eye is moving all over the place constantly because there's so much color, and a lot of that comes from this diversity and kind of cultural expression. So, the buildings are colorful. On the north end, we've got these great trees. This girl's hair right here is actually, I didn't Photoshop it, it's actually the exact same color of the flowers on this tree, which I just thought was incredible. But this is kind of another element that plays into the idea of Federal Boulevard and this cultural space, the idea that it is colorful, and there's tons of graffiti art that's along the boulevard, great murals. Are those things that we find valuable, that we think we want to try to protect or preserve? And then, the other piece of it that people did mention in the survey is the idea that it's historic. And so when people are thinking about Federal, is it, some of the elements that I mentioned earlier? Are people really thinking about the medians and the setbacks or the tree lawns? Or is it really more about kind of the historic buildings? We have some great civic buildings, some historic, beautiful buildings that line Federal Boulevard. And how do those play into our perception of the parkway? Because, they absolutely affect kind of our perception of it, of our view of Federal. As you travel along, you kind of get to experience the material and the kind of audacity of some of these buildings, but it's sort of outside the jurisdiction of the right-of-way. So what do those places mean to how we think about protecting and preserving Federal? So I just kind of wanted to close with some of these questions. When we think about all of these different elements, these physical features, kind of the atmospheric features, kind of expressions of culture, what does this mean for a historic or cultural landscape? And what are the things that we really value about Federal that as the city continues to move forward and as we continue to plan and build and develop some of these areas, what's really worth preserving? So I hope we get to have a discussion about that later. That's it.
So our next speaker is Ryan Soterakis, and Ryan is an urban planner and landscape designer with Dig Studio. His work experience includes schoolyards, large parks, master planning, and urban streetscapes. He worked previously with the Downtown Denver Partnership and the Business Improvement District, and so gained an intimate knowledge of downtown and worked on projects to enhance and enliven public spaces, including the 16th Street Mall, Skyline Park, and the downtown alleyways. And so Ryan's going to talk to us about probably our most highly designed landscape of the evening, the 16th Street Mall.
Thanks, Annie. Hi, everyone. Good evening. As Annie mentioned, I used to work for the Downtown Denver Partnership, so gained a really intimate experience with 16th Street Mall. I'm sure there's no shortage of opinions in the room about 16th Street, everyone's favorite place in Denver. So I want to tell the story of the mall a little bit, talk some about its history, talk about it as a cultural landscape, especially through the three lenses that Anne talked about earlier, which are period of significance, integrity, and characteristics. But in the vein of everyone else, I'm not going to make it easy on you, and I'm going to ask a bunch of questions as well. There's no easy answer. So, but to start off with, I want to prompt you to really think about the period of significance for 16th Street. So obviously, the 16th Street Mall, as we know it, is only about 35 years old. But 16th Street, as you can see, has existed for over 100 years, since Denver's early days. So which period, as we go through this, is more important to defining the space as a cultural landscape? So some images, you can see that the street has always connected important civic monuments. This is the old courthouse. If you ever wondered why Court Street is named that, that's why. It doesn't exist anymore. Has incredible views to the mountains. Has been lined with lots of beautiful historic buildings, some of which still exist, and was also the city's primary shopping street and retail hub, as well as the place for festivals and parades. So it's always sort of been Denver's main street, and always been the retail hub, dining hub, activity hub, spine of the city, if you will. It's also always served an important transportation function. It used to have streetcars running up and down it. Those were taken out mid-century when they were ripped up in most American cities. But then it became a popular cruising street. So culturally, it's held this sort of significance of movement. And even today, of course, with the shuttles running up and down it, that's arguably one of its more defining characteristics, if you've ever tried to hang out in the middle of it. So I want to give we'll give a little bit of history about the pedestrian mall as we know it today. So the AIA of Colorado began discussing this idea of a pedestrian mall in the early 1960s. And this is something that was very popular at the time all over the country. There were many of these built, not very many of them remain. But it was a response to the growth of suburban malls becoming a popular place for people to hang out. It was viewed as an economic development driver to get people to come downtown to shop and spend money. At the time, there was still a concentration of department stores downtown, so they hadn't all necessarily left, at least in Denver. So many of these pedestrian malls were built in the 1970s. The Downtown Denver Partnership originally led the charge for this, but their initial attempt failed. And then RTD, the transit district, was created in 1972, and their original idea for the mall actually included a PRT, which is a personal rapid transit system. There are very few of these. My hometown of Morgantown, West Virginia, actually has one on the campus of West Virginia University. It's very bizarre little 4-person vehicles. That didn't really fly, mostly because there wasn't enough density in Denver to support any sort of fixed rail transit at the time. However, transit was going to be a big component of this if the federal government was to pitch in funds, of course. Former governor of Colorado, Dick Lamb, was able to pull some money away from the 470 Beltway by reducing the planned lanes from 6 to 4. And that freed up enough money for the local match in order to get the federal funding from the FTA to build 16th Street. So at the time, the environmental movement was popular, and he was very adamant about reducing the impact of suburban sprawl, getting people back into the city. So the ultimate cost of the project was $76 million. And because the FTA funded, I think it was probably the 80% or something like that, it was required to be a transit mall. So hence we have the shuttles still with us. The primary designer of the mall was I.M. Pei, who, fun fact, just turned 100 a couple of weeks ago. He is still with us. And the primary landscape architect was Lori Olin. Started design in 1977. Construction began in 1980, and it opened in 1982. It's 35 years old. And this is actually a photo from opening day of the mall, which is pretty cool. There is a very long-standing urban legend about the design of the paving of the mall. Some of you have probably heard it, that it was designed to mimic a western diamondback rattlesnake. This is not true. Lori Olin himself has said that at the time they were getting to the point where they needed a design, he strolled into a souvenir shop on 16th Street, found a lovely belt that had a very interesting diamond pattern on it, and we therefore have the pattern of 16th Street. Yeah. The paving system, as I'm sure you've heard, has been a huge problem since it was constructed. There was a lawsuit over this, and I.M. Pei's office was actually paying RTD $120,000 a year for 25 years, which ended in 2012, to maintain and reconstruct the system. And currently, another fun fact, RTD spends $1.2 million a year to reset the pavers in the transit lanes. So I won't get into the details of the construction of that, but just so actually I'm going to go back a little bit. So Anne's second point was about the integrity of design. So in regards to the 1982 version of 16th Street that we are talking about here, some obvious integral elements are the design, maybe the workmanship, the materials, certainly. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the location and the setting and the association of a place are also important elements. So this design has only existed for 35 years, yet the street has been of cultural prominence for over 100 years, and the location and setting of it are not dictated by this design necessarily. So that's one of my first questions. What elements in defining integrity are most important when you talk about a place like 16th Street? I.M. Pei's original goals actually were for a very transparent design, that this street, that the horizontal plane was sort of this carpet that was rolled out edge to edge. The reason the lights are the way look the way they do, with very slender poles is because the goal was to maintain complete transparency from storefront to storefront across the street. So all of these lovely things in the street have all been added. None of this was part of the original design intent. So again, begs the question. And then, but in regards to this design, it does represent the highest and best ideals of the era that it was built. It's one of the highest quality pedestrian malls ever constructed, and one of the very, very few that is remaining, and arguably thriving. I think we could debate the finer points of that, but it's busy all the time. So it's important in that it's a remnant of a very popular thinking of the period, and it's held its value a lot longer than most pedestrian malls. So, however, one of the challenges over the years has been, in terms of a public space and a people space, the goals of urbanism and urban design have changed, and we are trying to think of streets as places, and a place for people to linger, spend time, hang out, gather and sit with their friends. As I mentioned, and I'm sure you know, the shuttles and the design of the mall in some ways sort of make that less comfortable because it was designed as a space for movement. So how do we change that thinking? And so these next few slides are showing some new ways that the Downtown Partnership and the city and various community groups have started to think differently about this. Again, raise the question, does this compromise or contribute to the design or the cultural significance of it? Not sure. So these are photos of an event called Meet in the Street. It's modeled after shuttle-free or car-free Sundays or Sunday streets all over the world. And the shuttle service discontinued for the entire Sunday. It's been going on for, I think, 3 summers now, with more and more each summer. And so they've been incredibly popular. If you've ever been to one, especially now that this has been going on for a few years, the mall is just packed with people strolling. Every block is a little different. Some of them feel like a park. Some of them feel like a shopping center, craft market. There's blocks for kids with play elements. There's art installations. There's live bands. There's been BMX competitions, crazy stuff. So, but it's a very, very different place without the buses. This past summer was the 16th Street Prototyping Festival. This was a way to encourage people. It was a competition for individuals and designers to submit ideas to sort of micro gathering spaces to encourage people to linger in the space. The shuttles did continue to run during these installations. They were then installed and voted on by the public, and funny story, my office did this one, which was solely designed to sort of highlight and reflect the trees, which are a really important aspect and design feature of the mall, and kind of pixelate it and just give you a place to sit here and make you reflect on the tree, and didn't think about the fact that as soon as we put this in, all the kids were like right up to the top. So we were all standing around like, don't fall. No one fell. And several of these stayed up through the summer for many months, and I believe they're doing this again. So this was a very different approach from the shuttle-free Sundays, and was sort of these very small little interjections and get people to think about different ways to inhabit the space. As I mentioned before, a big challenge if you think about it as a space to hang out, has been the medians. Though they're very lovely and shady in the summer with the honey locusts, they're narrow, they're really hard to program. It's hard to fit much in there, and you've got buses whizzing by on either side. So this project represents just a change in thinking about each block as a separate room, and coming up with creative ways to kind of shield the pedestrian from the effects of the shuttles. And also represents some relatively recent thinking about partnering with different cultural institutions around the city, which hadn't really been done before, giving them some sense of ownership of the 16th Street, increasing their brand presence. A lot of them aren't right in the center of downtown. So mixed successes here, but you may have noticed over the past few years that there's sort of a little injection in the medians of different blocks. Another couple ideas were to sort of harness that pedestrian energy of the mall and extend it into the alleyways. With art installations, pop-up events, and again, some of these create these smaller gathering spaces where people would spill out onto the mall, but you're a little bit more sheltered and protected. Or large art installations to visually connect the mall. My personal 2 cents is that one of the biggest flaws of the design is that it's not continuous. It's broken every intersection. So it's, instead of this continuous movement, you've got this punctuated experience where you as a pedestrian have to stop and wait for cars, which, because they have sort of the cues that they have dominance, go very fast through these intersections. So, but again, none of these elements were part of the initial design intent, right? They're all these additions and reflect changing cultural norms and desires for how to use the space. And so the third aspect was the landscape characteristics of a space. We've already talked about a lot of these, but some of the defining features of the transit mall portion, of course, are the double row of honey locusts, actually not this photo, this one better, the paving and the light fixtures. But there's a lot of other characteristics that existed prior, the buildings that frame the space, the views and vistas, the transportation function, some of the views to the Capitol as well, the other direction, and then some recent additions like the Millennium Bridge spire. You know, that's a fairly recent addition, but it's very prominent if you're at the southern end of the mall to see that spire. And then most importantly, the cultural traditions of the space. So it's Denver's Main Street, this retail hub. This history goes back 100 years. So closing with more and more questions to provoke some thought and debate. What are the most important characteristics to define a cultural legacy of a place like 16th Street? The street, maybe not 16th Street Mall per se. It's gone through a lot of iterations in 100 years. It will go through many more in the next 100 years. If it does change again, and because it's a public space, it certainly will. What does that reduce its value as a cultural landscape in the future? Is it a design landscape or a vernacular landscape? As sort of like Federal Boulevard, it's kind of a strange combination of both. And so it's important with streets and public spaces, I think, to continue to have dialogue and debate about these questions, because landscapes are in some ways more complicated than buildings, because they're constantly changing and evolving. So that's all. Thanks.